And here in the corner of the Piazza del Duomo, the courtyard of the cathedral, is the Biblioteca Capitolare, the ancient Veronese library dating back to the 400s. Let's head on in and have a look around, shall we? As we enter the Biblioteca Capitolare, we pass the ticket booth and head on inside to this magnificent building with the dual staircases. So let's head on up and take a look at some rare books. What do you say we do? And the first thing we see when we enter is the Great Hall. Wow, wouldn't you like to have one of these off of your living room? The scriptorium dates back to at least 517 because there's a manuscript dated to that date. The scriptorium, the Biblioteca, has over 90,000 volumes, 11,000 manuscripts, and 2,000 items of incunables or incunable. Those are items which were printed between Gutenberg Bible of 1450 and the year 1500. Let's go take a look at a few of them. Of all the items here in the Biblioteca Scriptorum, perhaps the most rare, the most valuable, is the manuscript of Ursicinus. The manuscript containing the lives of St. Martin and of St. Paul the Hermit, written by Jerome of Stridon, attests that the scriptorum was already active at least as early as the 6th century. The amanuensis, the person who actually did the copying and writing, signed the book 1 August 517 by the hand of Ursicinus, lector of the Veronese Church. In this informative wall chart, we follow the history of the Verona scriptorium. It was founded in the 4th century, and the building of the first Christian basilica, which is right outside the doors of the scriptorium. In 1517 was the drafting of manuscript 38, known as the Ursinius Codex. Somewhere around the 9th century was the arrival of the book from Spain with the first written riddle. In the 12th century, the courtyard was built of the canonry. 1345 was the discovery of Cicero's letters by Petrarch. Right around that time, both Petrarch and Dante and Boccaccio were known to have visited the Biblioteca here in Verona to study the great works in its libraries. 1630, the plague broke out in Verona, and the library was closed and many books were hidden. It was not until 1712 that the books were rediscovered, hidden in the scriptorium. Napoleon despoiled the library in 1797, and again in 1945, American bombs landed here. You can still find books with shrapnel embedded or covers torn from the bombing. Finally, in 2023, just this year, just a few months ago, this fabulous historical place reopened to the public. If you're ever in Verona, it's a must visit. Now this book here is a lot of fun. Not only is it old, but it contains the famous Veronese riddle. It represents the earliest written evidence of the evolution of the Italian language. It is a sentence contained in a prayer book which arrived in Verona from Spain between the end of the 8th and the beginning of the 9th century. Let me share this riddle with you and see what you think. He pushed the oxen forward, plowed a white field, held a white plow, and sowed a black seed. The answer to the riddle is precisely the activity of the amanuensis, which is a big fancy word for the scribe. He pushed the oxen forward, being his fingers. He plowed a white field, being the pages of the book. He held a white plow, the quill which he used to write with, and he sowed a black seed, being the ink. Although still among strong Latin elements, we can clearly get a glimpse of the vernacular linguistics and traits typical of the Veneto area and the riddle. The sentence thus gives us the image of a transitional phrase of a language that is no longer Latin, but which is not yet quite proper Italian. What a historical book. Now, in this case, we see a rotating example of the books which are held in the Biblioteca, including those from Dante, some marvelously hand-painted Bibles, some exquisitely rubricated and gold leaf books, and even an early edition of, you recognize that man, Galileo. Now, this exquisite book is a copy, 1491, of Dante's Divine Comedy. There on the left, you can see an illustration of Purgatory. Well, it's known that Dante Alighieri and Petrarch and even Boccaccio all spent time here in Verona at the scriptorium, studying other books in the library. What makes Dante so important and so famous? Well, he was the first author to actually write in the vernacular. All three of those authors were from the Tuscany region of Italy, and they wrote in languages that people could read and understand. Maybe not read, at least understand at the time. They wrote in the Italian language versus the Latin language, which had been the writing of scholars and clerics for 1,500 years prior. What a magnificent rare book. Here we see an extremely rare copy of a palimpsest. What is a palimpsest? This is the palimpsest of Gaius. It is a piece of vellum, usually, rarely paper, that was written on more than once. Back in the day, vellum was extremely expensive and hard to come by, and when people were done with the writing, they would use the white spaces or they would just write over it. That way they couldn't afford a new copy. Sometimes this was actually used as a codice as well. Perhaps the earlier writing was in Latin, and along the same lines, they would write in Italian and do the translation. This particular piece is the palimpsest of Gaius. It is the only remaining evidence of classical Roman law that's come down to us without subsequent tampering and reworking. It's the most important and extensive surviving witness to the Institutes of Gaius, a Roman jurist who lived during the time of Emperor Caligula. The manuscript is a palimpsest presenting several superimposed writings. The lower one is from the 5th century, presents the text of Gaius, while the upper 8th century, one of some Christian works. This volume is the Sacramentary of Wolfgang, a gift from beyond the Alps. The splendid Sacramentary, which is a book containing the central formulas of the Mass, bears witness to the cultural exchanges between the Veronese scriptorium and German cultural centers. The book was made in the monastery of St. Emmeram in Regensburg, where under Bishop Wolfgang, 924 to 994, a literary and artistic school had developed. The codex arrived in Verona as a gift to Bishop Ottbert, who served from 992 to 1008. The feasts of the Verona calendar were inserted here, and it was adapted to the liturgical use of the cathedral. In the first few pages, the text for the Eucharistic prayer have been highlighted with purple frames as well as silver and gold ink. These two books are some of the most rare in the scriptorum. These manuscripts, both books, contain the works of the History of Rome by Livy. The open volume talks about the Second Punic War, while the closed volume talks about the Macedonian Wars. The manuscripts, made in Florence around 1465, belonged to the Hungarian Count Ioannis Pannonius. After various vicissitudes in 1472, they became part of the library of the Hungarian King Matthias Corvinus in Budapest. Then they moved on to the Sultan in Constantinople in 1541, and finally came back to Italy through a Venetian merchant in 1560. They came to the Capitolare in the mid-18th century, were stolen by the French in 1797, and were finally returned in 1816. Both volumes have splendid Morocco bindings with gold inlays bearing the coat of arms of King Matthias Corvinus from the 15th century. Here we are again back in the Great Hall with these shelves filled with marvels of the bibliographic world. This scriptorum, unfortunately, was bombed by the Americans in 1945, and some of the books in this room still have shrapnel in them and still have some indications of how they were destroyed. Gee whiz, look at these volumes. I wonder if the library would let me rebind them for them. Probably not.